Hey, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 7, Day 1. The first thing that you need to complete is your journal number 1. This is a review of everything that has taken place in our country over the last 30, 40 years, asking you to just kind of look back and think what has been going on prior to the period that we're getting ready to study. Now, we studied a little bit of Reconstruction previously in Unit 6, but we never really get to spend as much time in Reconstruction as we like. So I just want you to go ahead and go back through and review there. Make sure you complete that journal. Today we're going to be talking about freedom and Reconstruction in the United States. Now, what were the lasting effects of the Civil War on the United States during Reconstruction? That's our big thematic question today, and we really want to think about how this has been changing over the last 5 to 6 years through the war and kind of leading into this time period that we're now going from 1865 to 1877. Following the Civil War, slaves had to find their place in society. It's a huge change now that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments have been passed in the North, that now in the South, those amendments are going to be kind of forced on to those people who were fighting for the Confederacy. In 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified, freeing all the slaves. Many white slave owners actually took offense to this. They felt abandoned by their slaves. They felt that they had been good to their slaves and offered them a new opportunity. And so for them, this was a chance for slaves to work and better themselves. But that's not obviously how the slaves viewed it, and it's not obviously how it really was. I asked the question here to you: were the slave owners justified? In their minds, yes, because they took advantage of simple pleasures that they never would have had the opportunity to without the slave owner. At least that's the way the slave owners were thinking. A former slave in Texas made this statement: right off, colored folks started on the move. They seemed to want to get closer to freedom so they'd know what it was like it was a place or a city. So that kind of gives you an idea of what the slaves are thinking right now, that they're just looking for freedom. And the problem is it's going to take a lot of years for those freed African Americans to get away from this idea that they are slaves. And obviously we know that it'll take many years before their rights will be better. African Americans also began to form their own organizations, such as churches, voluntary organizations, mutual aid societies, temperance clubs, debating clubs, drama societies, that's a typo, and trade associations. So these African American people who have been freed aren't just being freed and then, hey, let's just leave and not be involved in our country. They're being involved in a very specific way. They're trying to help other African Americans. They're trying to get involved politically and involved in society. African Americans wanted to hold political office, and you'll see a few African American people get involved in political rights immediately right out of the gate. They also began holding state conventions and rallies. One of the big issues here, and we'll talk about this later, though, for African Americans is slave owners tended to avoid letting African Americans have the ability to read or to have the opportunity to actually get an education. And because of this, that's going to make it very hard for them to be involved in political matters. Land ownership was also a big issue. African Americans wanted the land of their masters, and land redistribution was brought up. And essentially what William Sherman did, William Sherman actually gave land that was Southerners' land to African Americans in South Carolina and Georgia during his March to the Sea, as we call it, when we talk about it in Unit 5. But eventually this is going to be a problem, because when Reconstruction's over, you're going to see that the North is forced to give that land back to a lot of these Southerners. The plan comes to be known as the 40 acres and a mule plan, and it will hold that title for a lot of years. Education, like I said, was not very high among African Americans. 90% of all African Americans were illiterate at this point, meaning they couldn't read. African Americans were eager to continue to seek the ability to read and write, especially after the war. Roughly 30 colleges were founded 5 years after the war, and you'll see many more pop up after that. And a lot of that came from groups such as the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was a group of African Americans and others who were for abolition, who actually tried to assist newly freed African Americans in what they were going to be able to do, getting them jobs, helping them adjust to being free. The problem is that this newly acquired freedom is going to cause increased prejudice among whites because they feel that African Americans are now trying to take or infringe on their rights in some way, and not all whites. I don't want to put that in some overcompassed way, but just those like slave owners and people who had slaves at the time. This quote was from a northern tour in the South. The whites seem wholly unable to comprehend that freedom for the Negro means the same thing as freedom for them. They believe that they still have the right to exercise over him the old control. Okay, so that's going to be something that is constantly going on for years. So that's kind of the freedom part and talking about African Americans after the Civil War. The next thing we want to talk about is how is the North and the South rectifying those differences between themselves and trying to reincorporate the South into the Union, because the South is completely separated from the Union. Therefore, they're their own country. Now they have to basically be brought back in, and there has to be a way that they go about that. So the first option was Lincoln's plan, and this actually was brought up before the war was over, and it said that 10% of each Confederate state who had voted in the 1860 election must swear an oath of loyalty to the United States. So, Lincoln gets elected in 1860, so this is pulling from when they were still a country. So 10% of those people have to swear loyalty to the United States. Military leaders would not be eligible for pardons, and they would have their property and voting rights taken from them. This was to punish those who had led the Confederacy. A small increase to the rights of African Americans, however, did guarantee that the 13th Amendment to the Constitution had to be ratified in that state. So in order for a state in the South to come back, they had to do this. So this is the first plan that Congress passes. It offered amnesty, like I said, to all Southerners, as long as you were not one of those high-ranking officials. Now, Congress responded with an addition to this bill and kind of like trying to basically add their own spin to what they thought needed to happen. They called it the Wade-Davis bill, and that was who had chartered the bill. And this required an ironclad oath. And what that means is that it had to be that you never believed in the Confederacy, not just that I pledge my allegiance to the United States, but that the Confederacy should have failed and that I never supported that cause. And that had to be taken by over 50% of the people from each of the former rebel states. Now, the president would also appoint temporary governments to those states in order to carry out the law. The high-ranking officials would be stripped of their property and voting rights, just like we said before, and they would have to pass the 13th Amendment, which would obviously abolish slavery. The bill was passed in Congress, but Lincoln actually allowed the bill to die by not signing it. He ended up using what we call a pocket veto, and basically he just lets the bill sit there for the period of time that he has to sign it, and then if he doesn't sign it, the bill dies. Now, in 1865, obviously, Lincoln is assassinated right at the end of the war. He is the last death of the Civil War, and 50% of the people in the Wade-Davis bill had to take an ironclad oath. Well, Andrew Johnson, his VP, is going to come up with this plan that says 50% of people have to take a oath of allegiance, but they don't have to take this ironclad oath where they're completely denouncing the South. And the idea behind that is that it's going to be very hard to convince these people to denounce a cause that they were just fighting for not months before. Also, it would pardon all white Southerners who took the oath, which also once again excluded any wealthy planters and Confederate leaders. So they're really taking the upper class, which is your military leaders and your planters, and they're saying, we're not going to forgive you. Southern state conventions were also formed to ratify the 13th Amendment, and they had to deny secession and refuse to pay Confederate debts. So what they're trying to do is convince these states in this plan, convince these states to not pay for any of the debt, which would therefore make it very difficult for any of these Southern states to stay out of the Union. They're trying to force them to take this oath and ratify the 13th Amendment and come back into the Union. So a lot of things are being done here. In the South, whenever Andrew Johnson proposed this plan, obviously there was some hostility about it. And there was this creation of black codes. And black codes, guys, is something you need to be very familiar with because we had slave codes in Unit 4 that we talked about. Now we have black codes, which is basically just a different form of that. It's still limiting the rights of freedmen, basically just like the slave codes. And then eventually we're going to see these as Jim Crow laws. So this is kind of the predecessor to what will eventually be Jim Crow. Also, vigilante justice forms, white supremacist groups such as the KKK grow. In 1871, there was actually a law passed, so 6 years after the fact, there's a law passed which basically seek to outlaw organizations aimed at denying African Americans the right, as well as the KKK didn't just go after African Americans, they went after multiple groups that they targeted as inferior. And it originally did not start out as a vigilante type justice group, but that's kind of what it grows into over the course of 6 years. Now, the Republicans come up with this very radical plan, and they called it the Radical Republicans Plan. And this is actually the last plan that is passed, and it will be what really is the theme of Reconstruction for the last 10 years. It said that all southern states must rewrite their state constitutions, remove the black codes, ratify the 14th Amendment, which basically said that everyone born or naturalized in the U.S. Could not have their rights restricted. So if you're born here or you're a citizen here, you have the same rights as any other person, and no state can restrict those. And then the 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote, at least not being denied on the basis of race. So it's not going to do anything for you ladies yet, but it will at least not deny it on the basis of race. And then the last thing, and this is kind of the big one, is they placed the former Confederacy under military control. And you can go pull up the map. I don't have it here. But it divided into 5 military districts, each group in the South. And you had a U.S. general who actually controlled that district, and they were allowed to do anything they wanted to in order to make sure that everybody followed the law. All right, guys, here's your vocabulary. You have land redistribution, which we talked about a little bit, the Freedmen's Bureau that aided in African Americans and assisted them, the Wade-Davis Bill, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. And that is going to be all you need to worry about today. Don't worry about this assignment. We'll take care of that in another way. All right. Hope you have a good day, and let me know if you have any questions.